This podcast contains discussions of real criminal cases, including descriptions of violence, abuse, and other disturbing events. Some listeners may find this content too graphic or emotionally triggering. Listener discretion is strongly advised. This episode is not suitable for children or sensitive audiences. If you feel distressed at any point while listening, please consider pausing the episode and seeking professional support. Hello and welcome to this week's episode of Crime KE podcast. My good name is Ajuma and I am a human rights journalist from Kenya. This week we get into the murder of Winnie Chepkoech in Bomet County. Now, this is a case that has not been reported on as much as the cases that I normally handle on this podcast, but I think that this is an important story to tell. Now, this is a story about a family conflict that ends tragically, and it's even more heartbreaking because Winnie died in the hands of her own son. To begin this story, let me take you to Kababai village in Bomet County. It is March 1st of 2020 when the quiet of the village is suddenly broken by a woman's scream. Neighbors and residents, among them the area chief, Julius, are the first to arrive at the woman's home. There, they identify her as Winnie Chepkoech. Now, according to their court testimony, when they arrived at her home, they found Winnie already dead in a pool of her own blood. It looked like she had been hit on her head before she bled to death. Now, the neighbors who testified in court also say that they found Winnie's son, Victor Cheriot, in the house, and they found him holding the suspected murder weapon, which was a string metal. Police were called to the home and they processed the crime scene with the help of the area chief. Police recovered the spring metal and a green bloodied scarf, which belonged to Winnie, and both of them were taken for forensic examination as evidence. Victor was arrested and charged with his mother's murder. Now, the investigators' theory at this point was that a domestic dispute had occurred between Victor and Winnie, and he had killed his mother in the process. This theory was actually backed by Victor's father, Cheriot Rono, who was not at home on the day of the murder because he had traveled to Kericho. Now, Cheriot testified that Victor had been pressuring his mother to give him money, and his testimony was basically that the argument might have escalated while he was away and resulted in Winnie's murder. Now, after 9 months in police custody and an investigation into the death, Victor was arraigned at the court in Bomet on February 11 of 2021. He pleaded not guilty to the charge of murder. Now, his trial actually lasted for more than 5 years, with the prosecution providing the prosecution provided 9 witnesses to testify in the case. Now, the first 5 prosecution witnesses who were some of the people who arrived at the crime scene on the first day of the murder, including the area chief. These 5 testified to finding Winnie at the crime scene covered in blood and Victor holding the murder weapon, which was actually handed over to the police as evidence at the time. Victor's father also testified, telling the court that Victor and Winnie had a dispute that involved him asking her for money. The government analyst who tested the evidence in the case testified that he found Winnie's DNA in the scarf and the spring metal recovered from the crime scene. So, according to his conclusions, it was very clear that this spring metal was used to hit Winnie to death. The autopsy report presented in court also confirmed that she was struck on the head with a weapon. The pathologist concluded that Winnie died of a severe head injury caused by an assault. Now, after the prosecution's testimonies, the judge concluded that the evidence presented lined up with the testimonies from the autopsy to the DNA evidence and even the witness testimony from the 5 who arrived at the crime scene. So in May of 2025, the judge concluded that the defense had a case to answer, and at this point, Victor took the stand to defend himself. Victor told the court that he had no idea how the murder happened or even if it happened. Now, according to his story, he said that he could not have committed the murder because he would not even have been at the crime scene on that day. That is because he was in police custody at the time of the murder. Now, Victor had actually been accused of murder in 2019, which was just the previous year before Winnie was murdered. His point was that he was in police custody at the time of his mother's murder for the other murder that he committed in 2019. So he could not have been the one at the crime scene on the day of the murder, on the day of Winnie's murder. But at the end of it all, the presiding judge found that his testimony was actually not credible. And again, the evidence provided matched the prosecution's testimony. So on July 31st of 2025, the judge found Victor guilty of killing his mother, Winnie Chepkoech. The judge said that even though the evidence presented was largely circumstantial, it was overwhelmingly proving Victor's guilt in the case. The court believed that Victor used this spring metal to murder her mother, and he lied about being in police custody on the day of the murder. Now, despite all this, Victor was convicted of a lesser charge of manslaughter on 17th December of 2025. Now, the court said that he was not guilty of murder because the prosecution had failed to prove that the murder was premeditated and planned ahead of time. Thank you for staying with me until the end of this very short episode. You can support Crime KE podcast by sharing this episode with your friends so that we can get a larger community to listen to these cases. You can also follow the podcast on Instagram at crime.ke, or you can find me on Facebook at Ajuma Millicent for updates on the cases covered on the podcast. I have tagged the podcast contact information and social media pages in the show notes of this episode so that it is easier for you to reach out if you have any feedback on this episode or the podcast in general. Don't forget to give the podcast a 5-star rating on Spotify and catch the next episode of Crime KE podcast on Thursday next week on the same platform you're listening from right now. But until then, stay safe and remember, it is crime with a K.